You've probably heard the term post-truth used quite a bit over the past few years. Most obviously, it's used in relation to politics and the way in which some leaders have demonstrated a careless and even cavalier attitude to facts in public life. Our guest today, Dr. Benjamin Jones from Central Queensland University, is the co-editor of History in a Post-Truth World, Theory and Praxis, which was published by Routledge in 2021. The book explores how history and historians have been caught up in some of the problems associated with post-truth, and provides an interesting discussion that wrestles with a definition of post-truth, what is it, and whether it's actually something that is new. The book then includes a number of chapters by a range of different scholars who come at this problem from unique perspectives and sometimes actually disagree. Today, Ben and I concentrated our discussion on the broad concept of post-truth and his specific chapter, which explores some of the ways which this has affected public discussions about the stolen generations in Australia. Before the interview begins, I do need to warn you that some of the issues that are discussed in this episode cover issues and events that are not necessarily comfortable, particularly for those who may have been affected by policies associated with the stolen generations. I'm raising this at the beginning so that listeners may use their discretion in which parts of the interview they wish to listen to. As always, thank you for listening to this podcast, and thank you to our members and patrons who make all of the work that we do at the History Teachers Association of New South Wales possible. For more information on membership, upcoming events, and our resources, please visit www.htansw.asn.au. And here's the interview with Dr. Ben Jones. Hi Ben, it's great you can join us today, and I just want to start by actually congratulating you on the publication of this book. I know it's not necessarily new at the moment, but I've only recently come across it, so congratulations. I think it really does a great job of contributing some really important ideas to contemporary discussions around history. So congratulations.
Oh, thanks so much, and it's a pleasure to talk with you. And History in a Post-Truth World was an interesting book for me because I'm usually focused on Australian political history for the most part, and this was a nice deviation into, I suppose, the philosophy of history. And I found it really stimulating, and I learned an awful amount. I should quickly say that it's not a book I've written. I've co-edited it, and I learned an enormous amount about how post-truth affects history from some wonderful colleagues all around the world. And it's firmed up my conviction that this is a universal phenomenon. This isn't an Australian or a United States or a United Kingdom aberration, even though post-truth is generally used in the context of talking about either Brexit or talking about the election of Donald Trump. But this is something we can identify everywhere.
Yeah, I must admit, before reading this book, I probably had a little bit of resistance to the term post-truth, and I wonder if that was because I had seen it applied to different contexts, perhaps, and I was thinking more in an Australian context. I guess I was a bit hesitant to sort of agree that the idea captured something new, but actually, this book really, I think, challenged my thinking on that. So, it's challenged you, it's challenged me. I think, anyone who reads it is going to find something in it that really is new and interesting, I think. But that's actually a good place to start then. Can you maybe capture and explain what you mean by this term post-truth? Because it sits central, obviously, to the book.
Yeah, so post-truth actually was coined back in the 90s by a writer called Steve Tessich, but it really came to prominence in 2016. And as I said, it was the successful Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump that saw it just shoot up. If you look at if you look on Google, the number of uses of it just skyrocket in 2016. So it seemed to just capture the zeitgeist for various reasons then. And the Oxford Dictionary made it the word of the year, and their definition, I think, is as good as any, which is when emotions and feelings are more influential than facts and evidence informing your opinion. So that's generally what we mean by post-truth. It's when your feelings dominate, and it's generally used in the context of politics. So just one example is Donald Trump claiming without any evidence that actually he won the popular vote. And this is after he himself initially said, no, I didn't. But the reason I didn't was because of this. I didn't campaign in that way. And then he changed it to, no, I actually did. And you can point out the inconsistencies. But if people feel emotionally attached to him and they feel attached to his message, they're happy to ignore inconsistencies. So what was really the genesis of the book then was saying, well, does this apply to history as well? It's used so ubiquitously now with politics, and is there a specific meaning and dimension to how this is used in history? And we found that there was, or at least tried to make that case.
And the book goes even further than that, doesn't it? Because I mean, obviously the concept of post-truth is central, but you even in the title of the book kind of take it to talk about history in this post-truth world. So it's not just, as you sort of intimating there, it's not just contained to politics. It's actually spreading around into different aspects of our lives. I wonder if you can give some more shape to that idea as well, this idea of a post-truth world.
Sure. Well, specifically post-truth history, we give a definition to. When I say we, myself and Marius Gudonis, who's a scholar in Poland at Collegium Civitas, and I'll quote our definition, if you don't mind, just to start. So we say post-truth history is the communication of false information on a historical phenomenon that appeals to emotion and personal belief, where both the purveyor and the recipient are indifferent to historicity and contemptuous of expert opinion that contradicts it, and where the underlying objective is ideological, especially in support of a collective identity or a political program. So, what we're really trying to highlight is that lies are nothing new. There have been lies since there has been human language and communication, but a lie necessarily involves the liar trying to deceive the person they're lying to. Propaganda has always existed, at least since there have been political regimes. But again, that involves a top down government sort of trying to dupe their people, in a sense, of trying to push out a particular narrative. So if post truth history is a distinct thing and is worthy of a book, it's in this idea that it's all tied to indifference, and it's almost a pact or a handshake. So, unlike a lie where you're trying to trick, it's where the recipient wants to be tricked. They want to hear a particular message, and both the purveyor and the recipient are indifferent, which is really troublesome for historians like myself, because it effectively is describing a scenario where you can have historians pulling out evidence from the archives and saying, wait a minute, this narrative is incorrect. And both the person saying the false information and the person receiving it sort of shrug and say, look, we don't care. This is the historical narrative we prefer. So, go back and bury yourself under some books, and we'll continue to spread this false idea of history.
Can we do a little history then here for a second and think about the factors that have actually brought this about? I mean, the sort of basic argument seems to be that this idea of a post-truth position by communicator and receiver, so to speak, has become more prominent around the world. What are the factors that have underpinned its prominence?
Well, in the book itself, actually, and this is just one of the joys of edited collections, we have a couple of chapters at least who actually say this isn't really a new thing. This has been going on forever, and there's especially a chapter on feminist history saying. especially men's opinions and feelings towards women overriding facts and evidence is a very long story in feminist scholarship. So Alana Piper and Anna Stevens wrote that chapter, and it's a good one. If the argument can be sustained that there's something new-ish going on, I think it has to be tied with the internet and mass availability of the internet, and what I would term the memification of history, in that revisionism used to be this long, arduous journey that if you wanted to have a false narrative, and probably the best example of this, I think, is Holocaust denialism. And what Holocaust revisionists used to do is they went to enormous effort to even start their own journals that look like sophisticated academic journals, and they'd go into the archives and produce all this stuff. It's all false history, and it's all built around trying to spread a false narrative. But they had to go to an awful lot of effort to try and do it and to try and give it this sort of clout. Whereas in the digital age, if you can just put a meme together, or if you have the crudest Photoshop skills, provided you're communicating the message that the audience wants to hear, you really don't have to bother with all that hard work. In a matter of seconds, you can spread false history. And one example that I find humorous, even though it's incredibly dangerous, is there's this completely false message that Australia Day is going to be changed to Citizen Day, and it usually has some sort of underlying racist thing that this is to appease, immigrants or refugees or whatnot. And it's been going around since the days of John Howard. And first they'd put a photo of John Howard saying, "I refuse to change the day." And then when he stopped being Prime Minister, they put Kevin Rudd's face and attributed it to him. And then so on. And it's been recycled through a number of Prime Ministers now. And so you can easily point out that this is not a statement that any Prime Minister has made, but that won't really impress much the type of people who share it and who give it likes on Facebook and shares on Twitter, because that's the kind of message they want to hear. They want to hear a Prime Minister standing up to, what they perceive as attacks on Australia Day.
So you've raised there some examples of where we might see a post-truth kind of phenomenon in Australia. Are there others as well? I mean, is it a prominent thing in Australia? Is, I guess, the question I'm asking there.
Yes, it seems to be a phenomenon around the world, and again, another example in the book is in India. In their school textbooks, the way that Hitler is presented has become progressively more gentle. He's still portrayed largely as a bad guy, but this concept of downplaying, which I know we're going to talk about more later on, has started to come up again and again. And there's a chapter on Indigenous history in New Zealand where it actually starts with a joke. A prominent US comedian makes this joke saying that the Maori aren't the Indigenous people of New Zealand, but they actually attacked, conquered, and in some versions ate the Moriori, who they say are the Indigenous people. And Andre Brett writes that chapter about how again, it doesn't take a book, it doesn't take a pseudo history revisionist journal now. It just takes a prominent comedian with a Netflix special saying it, and these false ideas instantly go out, and people who want to believe it are going to believe it, and it's quite unempowering, unfortunately, for historians who think, well, how do we even have the reach to go out and tell the millions of people who just listen to that on Netflix that no, there's that's not true at all.
And so clearly your chapter is focused very much on the issue of the stolen generations and the public discourse and discussion around this in Australia. And so I want to spend a bit of time talking about that, because I think it's not only sort of important, obviously, but again, I think it's very locally relevant to us. And, it's in probably That's in the Australian curriculum. It's in most of the curriculums that the states have developed to teach history in secondary schools. Firstly, can you set out what you would consider to be, anyway, the broadly sort of agreed upon understanding of the stolen generations among historians? So among academic historians, can we sort of grab a broad consensus, and what is that?
Sure. Well, generally, when we speak of the stolen generations, we mean from the early 20th century till around the 1970s, the thousands of Indigenous children who were taken from their families and placed in different places, sometimes in state institutions, sometimes missions and other religious institutions, and sometimes they were privately adopted. But it is a tricky topic, and Bain Attwood's one of the leading historians on Indigenous history, specifically Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations. And he notes that the stolen generations is not so much history as collective memory. And Robert Mann, who also writes extensively on this, says it's a moral shorthand for a collective tragedy. So it's messy in that what we mean by the stolen generations isn't always the same. And Tim Rouse, who's another leading academic in this field, and he actually published a very good book recently, Aboriginal and Non-Aboriginal Australians since 1901. And he makes the point that the stolen generations effectively has two definitions. There's an emotional definition and an empirical definition. And the emotional one is that in the same way that the 1967 referendum is sometimes held up as the moment Indigenous Australians became citizens, or the time that they got voting rights. And in a technical sense, that's not correct. In a legal sense, that's not correct. But it also has power as a narrative that for a lot of Indigenous people, it felt like that was the recognition and that was the watershed moment. And the stolen generations is a bit the same in that it has this emotional definition, and it has a openness where Indigenous people can effectively self-identify. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they were taken, but because it was a collective tragedy that happened to their people. And it can also mean broader things like the intergenerational trauma if a parent or relative was a member of the stolen generation. But then it also has a more empirical meaning, which is just the Indigenous people who were taken. And then that has other questions about in what way were they taken, what was the level of parental agreement, if there was any. So I realize that's a very long answer to what was quite a short question, but I think it generally is certainly seen as a tragedy that affected thousands of Indigenous people for the larger part of a century.
One of the arguments you make in your chapter there is that you claim that there has been a range of attempts across the last, probably, what is it, the last 20 or 30 years, I think, is really roughly the time frame that you're sort of investigating. That in that time frame, there's been a range of attempts to kind of downplay this history. What is downplaying, and what does that look like in practice connected to this issue of the stolen generations?
Didier Fassin has a really useful definition between denial and denialism. And essentially, denial can be a form of self-delusion, not being able to accept or not being able to realize reality. But denialism is political. It's an ideological position where, for a range of factors, you want to believe a false narrative and you want to also push a false narrative. And so that's getting onto what we define as post-truth history. Downplaying is not the same, But I argue in my chapter that there's a symbiotic relationship that when new historical information comes to light or when new historical movements come, if they're particularly challenging or traumatic for some people, then downplaying can be phase one and denialism phase two. And you can see that, for instance, with climate change, for instance. There are some people who outright say, no, it's not happening. But that's not a position, say, a politician or many journalists could really hold up because it's so against the scientific consensus. But there certainly are politicians who can sort of wink or dog whistle towards denialists by deliberately downplaying and saying, look, I don't deny that the temperature's changing, but we don't need to act so fast and it may not be as bad. So with the stolen generations, as you say, my chapter does look at the last 20 or so years. Really, it starts around the time of the Bringing Them Home report, which was tabled in 1997. And this was a watershed moment. This was in federal parliament, 500 personal testimonies from Indigenous people saying what their experience was like and really putting out just the horror and the terror and of having children removed, and significantly, I think as well, the fear of having their children removed, which shouldn't be ignored either. And I often think of conscripts in the Vietnam War. It was obviously terrible for those who were conscripted who didn't want to go. But there also was just an air of fear if you were a young man in the 70s. And this has a psychological impact. And you can imagine, well, how much worse any time you see a government official, anytime you see a police car, of having this uncertainty of if my house doesn't seem clean enough or or whatever other small reason it might be, that the fear that your children could be taken is extraordinary. So this all came out, and initially the Bringing Them Home report probably did overestimate how many Indigenous children were taken. They said 1 in 3. An Australian Bureau of Statistics survey put it closer at 1 in 10, which I think, and Robert Mann and other people say is probably more reasonable, but it's still a large number of people. But it also created a sense of guilt, which a lot of people were uncomfortable with. And a lot of Australians want this sort of story. And John Howard said that there's a yearning in the community for an Australian story, which is one of heroic struggle and triumph, whereas a story of doing a grave injustice to the First Nations people is not the story that everybody wants to hear. And so the downplaying is stuff like there were articles in Quadrant, for instance, in the immediate aftermath saying, were some children taken? Probably, but it probably isn't as big as it's being cracked up to be. And in various newspapers, there were articles saying, for the most part, it probably was because the children were being neglected, and there probably were good reasons. And actually, quite recently on Sunrise, one of the commentators there said maybe we need to do it again. And I think that's the result of 20 years of downplaying, to the point where now people are asking, well, was it even a bad thing? And I think it's important for historians to have on record, and there's legitimate historical debate about exactly how many were taken, what were the conditions they were taken under. But I think certainly we've got the wrong narrative going out there if the idea is this actually was a noble endeavor that possibly we need to do again.
And you're very careful in the chapter to make a distinction between downplaying and what you kind of call a post-truth approach or attitude to this issue. And I know you're saying there's some symbiosis there and there's some connection between them. But would like you to explore, if possible, a bit more that distinction. I mean, what is a post-truth attitude to this issue then, in comparison to just downplaying?
I think the best example I could offer would be something like the Bill Leak cartoons, which, in my opinion, are racist, and they show uh, drunken, neglectful Aboriginal parents who have their kid brought back by a policeman, and he says, "Oh, what's his name then?" Referring to his own child, and that is the sort of post-truth history that unfortunately spreads. And when that came out, of course, Leake and his publisher defended it and saying, look, I'm not saying every Aboriginal dad is like that. I'm just saying there are issues with alcoholism, as there are, one rushes to add, in non-Indigenous Australia as well. Uh, but the danger of it is that that's the type of thing which can be shared so quickly on social media, and the type of people who already have this emotional sensibility and this feeling that they want to think that Indigenous parents are neglectful, and that explains why the stolen generations happens, and that explains ultimately, and this is a bit of pop psychology, I acknowledge, but I think at the root of a lot of it is white Australians or non-Indigenous Australians not wanting to feel guilty and not wanting to feel bad about their history. But I think that's not the best coping mechanism. I think a better coping mechanism is acknowledging the wrongs of the past and having sympathy and empathy and trying to heal and move towards reconciliation, rather than trying to sort of rewrite history in a way that says, well, it probably was all for their own good anyway. And I'd just like to quickly point out the ABS statistics as well. That were Indigenous children before 1970, about 1 in 10 were taken, were removed, and then that dropped to Indigenous children born after 1980, 1.6%. So I think those who are in the denialist camp or who are pushing this post-truth history, they somehow have to reconcile this incredible statistic, if it only ever was removal for their own good or for legitimate reasons of neglect, then why did it suddenly drop from 10% to only 1.6 needing to be removed? Unless they're proposing that there was an incredibly radical improvement in Indigenous parenting in that tiny period of time. I think the far more logical and sensible and historically strong answer is that government policy stopped removing children at such high numbers.
One of the other themes that I thought was really interesting and important in this chapter is this idea that history as a discipline does have at its core this idea that revisionism is actually a good thing. And I mean something specific here by revisionism. I don't mean this, attempt to just rewrite history for whatever reason. I mean this idea that history is that the HCAR idea, isn't it? It's unending dialogue between the past and the present. And we're constantly finding new material to work with. We're constantly finding new ways, like methodological lenses, to look at this material. We're constantly finding ourselves in new situations where old questions might become more prominent again. So that's what I mean by revisionism, is that we're constantly kind of reimagining and rethinking and recommunicating the past in many ways. And you defend that as an important aspect of the discipline. What's different about legitimate, in inverted commas, historical revisionism and this kind of post-truthism that you're pointing out?
Yeah, well, revisionism is a noble thing in its best sense, and if you go back to 1981, then someone like Henry Reynolds was the biggest revisionist out there, pointing out the violence on the Australian frontier. So in its true sense, and in its noble sense, it is a good thing. And I suppose what makes post-truth history different, though, at least in the way we describe it, is that its central element is indifference to history. So any historian, worth the name, they start with a research question, not a research answer. And they go out to the archives and, or they conduct oral history, or they uh, go to whatever sources they can find, and they try to answer that question. And whether you're doing a first year essay or honors thesis or a PhD, you're going to have a supervisor or a teacher constantly pressing on you that the question comes first and then you research it. And I suppose that's where post-truth history has it back to front, in that the answer comes first, and it's an answer that has strong emotional resonance with both the purveyor and the recipient. And then what is just a tragedy for academics and for historians is that it then has this indifference to history. So it's actually in spite of what the archives may reveal, it's in spite of what the primary sources and the oral history, it's in spite of that the answer has been already agreed upon, and it's just a matter of trying to defend it.
So, could you explain or outline an example where you think a historian has reevaluated, reassessed, and kind of examined the issues surrounding stolen generations history and come up with something slightly different that is still actually good scholarship? It's not post-truth, it's not downplaying, but it's actually good scholarship that challenges some of our thinking about these issues.
Well, two examples come to mind. One I think is good scholarship, the other I think isn't particularly good scholarship, but I would perhaps broadly call them both revisionist in a sense. Uh, Keith Windschuttle's fabrication of Aboriginal history, I don't think is particularly strong scholarship, but I would call that revisionism rather than denialism, because he doesn't uh, have indifference to history. And I think that indifference is really the key to what makes something at least historical scholarship, whether you agree with it or disagree with it or not. As I mentioned, Henry Reynolds himself was very much revisionist. When The Other Side of the Frontier came out in 1981, I think Tim Rouse, in several of his books, uh, could be considered to be doing revisionism, in that he certainly challenges what has become a popular narrative, not so much among historians, but in the broader public, that every stolen generations was something like that traumatic scene in Rabbit Proof Fence with a child being ripped from the mother's arms by a policeman. And so, in a sense, his work is revisionism as well, pointing out that in many cases, children were taken to be reunited with their parents. But as he points out, it still boils down to the mass institutionalization of a kinship group. So I suppose that that's where I would draw the distinction between revisionism and denialism or post-truth history. Revisionists still care about history. Revisionists still go to the archives. They still read sources. And even if it ultimately ends up being poor scholarship, in your opinion, or in the consensus of most historians, that at least is at a certain level, still using the language that historians use and understand. Whereas when it drops down to what a lot of tabloid journalists have done with the stolen generations, and one particularly high profile tabloid journalist openly calls the stolen generations a myth, for instance. And that to me, particularly because it's with indifference to history and it's without any footnotes, any type of original research to back it up. It's just his feeling seems to be that that it's a myth and that it never would have, no children ever would have been taken except for legitimate reasons. So that's where I would draw the line between revisionism and denialism or post-truth history. It comes down to, is there an indifference to history or not?
I think this is becoming pretty clear from how you've been sort of responding to these questions and the ideas that are obviously contained in the book there. But I think it's important for this discussion. Why does post-truth and post-truth history concern you so much?
A very selfish answer might be, I'm worried that people will stop listening to me and stop valuing my opinion. I'm quite fond of a passage from Friedrich Nietzsche, his parable of the madman, and he talks about what he thinks the world would be like without God. And he has the madman running around saying, is not this deed too great for us? Is there no up or down left? Are we not just flying sideways, upside down through an infinite nothing? And to me, that's kind of like what a post-truth world really looks like. It's the death of expertise. And it's not that experts are godlike and can give absolute answers. But I think the democratization of knowledge and the democratization of opinion is a really dangerous thing. I don't want a world where the opinions of random people on Facebook towards vaccinations are given equal weight to the chief health officer. And I don't want a world where what some person thinks about the construction of a new bridge is given equal weight to engineers. And so in that same sort of vein, I don't welcome a world where anyone's opinions or memes on history are given equal weight to historians. And I realize there's an element perhaps of eliteness, or they could be accused of some sort of ivory tower syndrome. But I do think we have historians for a reason, and we've had professional historians for about 200 years. We've had historians in general since people started telling stories, and we are storytelling animals. And particularly because of the power of history to shape narratives, and in many cases, genocides have been the precursor to it has been false history and the demonization of certain people. So there's a power to history, and to that extent, there needs to be some regulation on it. And I think a world where academic historians and history teachers in schools have training and use peer review and use other methods that historians are used to ultimately serves as a safeguard against just anything being considered true if it feels right.
So I've got two more questions for you. One is personal, and then the other is a bit more kind of broad, I suppose. So to take the personal one first, I want to give you an opportunity to just describe how you work as a historian. I don't actually think this is super well known. A lot of people are not historians, obviously, right? And they have this imagined version of what a historian actually does. So, taking some of the themes that we've talked about here today, I mean, we've acknowledged that history, I think, implicitly at least, historians can't have this one final view of whatever it is that they're addressing. It's an argument, and it's an ongoing argument often. How do you manage that with the other, I guess, recognition that you're making here, or the other argument that you're making, which is history is important and it needs to be done in a scholarly and a serious and a kind of and a formal way. What does doing history for you look like with those things around, swimming around you?
That's a great question. And my answer, I suppose, goes back to what is the purpose of a research university and what's the point of a professional historian. And I don't think Australian historians especially realise the debt of gratitude we owe to Germany and the German school back in the 19th century, and thinking of Humboldt and Ranke and especially the pioneers at the University of Berlin, which then the Cold War got split, and I think it's now still two different universities, Humboldt and the Free University of Berlin. But right back then, they were asking these serious questions as well about how do we have history seminars and how do we put in safeguards. And the whole idea of the history seminar was about accountability. And this is something Ranke really drilled home. And this is a time when, in England, for instance, the great historians, people like Thomas Carlyle and Macaulay, and Carlyle was an essayist, and Macaulay was a minister for war. It was something, rich people could do as sort of a hobby, and they write these epic histories of England. But it was really the Germans who professionalized it, and they put in these safeguards. And one was the history seminar, where you don't just publish and put it out there, but you have to face your peers, and they may erupt in applause, but more likely than not, given human nature, and I don't think it's much different at a conference today than it was back then, they're going to go, I'm just going to raise my hand and show how smart I am by pointing out, I'm going to take this guy down a few pegs. And, and there's an art to seeing, well, which guy's just jealous, which person is, about to write an article saying the opposite, and maybe they've got an agenda. But more likely than not, more often than not, you do end up with a more rigorous and a better history for taking part in these seminars. And the second is the history journal, which we also get from the Germans, Historische Zeitschrift, again from the University of Berlin. And this is, historians moan and groan about Reviewer B and how critical and horrible they always are. But again, this is one of our great safeguards for the veracity. And since postmodernism, especially in the 70s, and since then, historians are aware that we can't escape our biases. We can't escape the environment, and we talk a lot about presentism now, and being aware that however objective we want to be, we are always going to be shaped by our environment, our culture, our upbringing, our race, our gender, and everything else. But at least through the processes of peer review and through presenting your work before others, I think you can at least get the best possible version of history out there. So, I'm sometimes quite a shy, emotional person who'd really rather just write something and put it out there and then never hear the comments. And sometimes I force myself to conferences. My heart sinks when I see hands raised. I sort of dream for the one where just no one says anything and I can run out of the room, but it makes me a much better historian. And if I could just add, at especially our Australian Historical Association conferences, it really is dominated by university historians. And perhaps that's just the nature of the beast to an extent, but I absolutely encourage history teachers to go, whether they want to present or whether they just want to be around it. And I think there is just so much to be gained for history teachers, and we really value their participation in the conference. And it's online this year coming, so there's no travel concerns. But I do think conferences make me a better historian and also make me a better history teacher.
And the last question is bouncing off the back end of the introduction to this book. And I want to quote from it, if that's okay. It's a few sentences. So here you and your co-author say, many historians and other academics recoil from public debate and commentary, not wishing to compromise the appearance of objectivity and non-partisanship. Whatever noble intentions may motivate that stance, it robs the public of valuable commentary on important issues. It is not enough, we suggest, to provide evidence-based research in peer-reviewed journals and at academic conferences. Particularly, scholars who work in a public university have a moral obligation to engage with the public that funds them. Post-truth history must be challenged not only in academic circles, but also in the popular press and in the online space, where much disinformation originates. This is an extension of what you've just been saying, but the question I want to put to you on the basis of that comment is, how do you see the role of historians in a modern democracy? And are there examples of historians doing what you're advocating here in a constructive way, do you think?
Well, I think there's enormous power in history and in historical narratives. So, the role of the historian is to tell these stories. And especially, as I said in that quote, if you are funded by a public university, I think you then have a particular obligation to serve the public and to think of yourself as a public servant. And yes, I think there's lots of historians who step outside the normal role, and it is incredibly important, of course, for historians at a university to teach their students, and they can't sort of leave the lecture, half an hour early to go protest something. It's incredibly important that they train the next generation of historians and the next generation of history teachers, and also just all the other students who come into a history class. And it's wonderful whenever we get people in my classes and I hear that they're doing a law degree or medicine or this, that, or whatever, but they value history and wanted to take an elective history unit. Uh, Two historians come to mind of the public advocacy side, though, and the moving outside of academia. The first is Professor Peter Stanley, who was the head historian at the Australian War Memorial. And he's been really active, actually, in being critical of the recent War Memorial expansions and the $500 million. And I think it really took someone like Stanley, who has that clout, not only of being the author of something like 30 books now, he's prolific, but also that stature as being the former head historian at the War Memorial, where people actually will listen and don't just have that reflex, oh, another lefty academic, who's against the Anzacs or something. But here's someone who's thought more deeply and done far more research than most people on Australia's war history and how it should be presented. And so I think when he stood up, uh, people took notice. And I'd also mention David Stevens, who's the head of Honest History, which is a great resource for history teachers if they're not aware of it. His website has a lot of articles from history. There's a Honest History book, which a lot of very good historians have written in. And so I think they're doing a lot of good work in that space. Professor Claire Wright comes to mind as well, the author of Daughters of Freedom on Australian women's rights advocates. And apart from being an excellent historian and writing this wonderful book, again, she doesn't just live in her office. She's out there campaigning, and she makes the point, especially about our statues, which is something that just seeps into the unconscious. Most people don't particularly count how many male statues there are. But Claire has. And about 4% of statues in Australia are of women. And there are actually more statues of animals than there are of women. And it takes someone like Claire getting out, you can say that to your students and they'll go, oh, that's terrible, But you really need to get out there and start saying it in the media. And I think she deserves a lot of credit for two new women, Eden Lyons and Dorothy Tagnier, getting statues of themselves in Canberra, which is a wonderful achievement. And, I don't think that changes the 4% very much, maybe 5%. So there's still more to go. But So she would just be another example of a historian who not only takes her academic work seriously, but also takes it seriously, saying, well, if I've spent a lifetime building up this historical knowledge, I've got to do something with it beyond the academy. I think there are too many prolific Twitter historians for me to start naming them, not least yourself, Jonathan. But I think that actually is such a quick and easy way for a historian who may feel incredibly time poor, as most of us do. And you certainly don't have to be edgy or controversial, but there is still clout to being an academic historian. And I think, certainly, I think journalists who are always on Twitter as well, I think they do notice when academic historians make comments about the way history is being presented and a whole range of issues to do with universities. Uh, so yeah, I think that's another place where historians can get outside the borders of academe and make a tangible difference in society.
They're good examples, and I'm glad you raised Claire. I think she's a fantastic example, and the book and the arguments that are she's built on top of the book, You Daughters of Freedom, was just, I think, been fantastic. And they forced a lot of people, myself included, to rethink a lot of different things about our past, and I think that's a healthy thing. And yeah, a good example, and yourself as well. I mean, I'm not just flattering you here. I'm recognizing the fact that you've taken the time to spend an hour with me on this Thursday morning. That you, as you said, you're busy, I'm busy, and I think the fact that you're willing to sort of put time into talking about this in public and in a way that hopefully is accessible to teachers. Not every teacher has, let's face it, the time to go and read a ton of books every week. So this puts your ideas in a way that they can really access. So thank you again, and yeah, please stay in touch and keep up the good work.
My pleasure. Thank you.